On the 8th of May 1945, Germany surrendered, and across the scorched landscape of Europe, thousands of steel giants sat utterly still. Panthers crouched in the shadows of pine forests. Tigers rusted in muddy fields outside shattered villages. Panzer IVs sat wheel-deep in the soft earth of riverbanks, engines cold, crews long gone. The German armoured force that had once rolled into Poland, France, and the Soviet Union was now a shadow of its former self. Months of fuel shortages, relentless Allied bombing, and a grinding retreat across two fronts had bled the Wehrmacht dry. By the time the surrender came, hundreds of vehicles had been abandoned where they stood, many with empty tanks, others with engines or gearboxes, deliberately smashed by departing crews, determined to deny their machines to the enemy. Allied soldiers, moving through the Ruhr, Bavaria, and the smoking ruins of Berlin, stumbled upon these metal carcasses everywhere. Some were nearly intact, mechanically sound but for worn components. Others had been gutted, radios stripped, optics removed, engines cannibalized to keep a sister vehicle running for just a few more miles. Quickly and methodically, the victors moved to claim what the defeated had left behind. American technical intelligence teams catalogued hulks at Oberursel and Geldorf. British Remy units swept through Hillersleben and Sennelager, with clipboards and cameras. Soviet trophy brigades rolled across Silesia and into Berlin, loading vehicles onto flat cars, with the practiced efficiency of men who had been studying their enemies' machines for 4 brutal years. By the summer of 1945, Germany's armoured fleet, what was left of it, sat in Allied-controlled yards beneath a heavy sky, waiting to learn its fate. Curiosity quickly gave way to cold analysis. The Americans shipped their prizes across the Atlantic to Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland. There, engineers who had spent the war wondering how a Panther's gun could punch through Allied armor at ranges that seemed impossible, finally had their answers. They fired rounds. They measured penetration. They tore open gearboxes and counted the wear on final drives. The verdict was both admiring and damning. Extraordinary firepower, exceptional optics, and mechanical systems that broke with alarming frequency. The British conducted their own examinations, mostly inside Germany itself. Their engineers spent long hours comparing the Panther's elegantly sloped hull with the boxy silhouettes of the Sherman and Churchill. They confirmed what their tank crews had reported from the battlefield. The German optics were superb, the guns devastating. But servicing these machines in the field had been a nightmare. Every repair required specialists, special tools, and parts that were perpetually in short supply. The Soviets, characteristically, were more pragmatic. They had already learned everything they needed to know about German tanks the hard way. On the steppes of Ukraine, in the ruins of Stalingrad, in the mud of the Kursk salient. Trophy brigades collected Panthers and Stugs, largely for training purposes, using them to teach new crews what they might face in future conflicts. The conclusions confirmed what Soviet commanders had long suspected. The Germans built magnificent weapons that wore themselves out. By the early 1950s, most of those captured tanks had been scrapped. The spare parts had run out, and there was no one left to make more. Testing complete, the Allies faced a harder question: what to do with thousands of tons of armoured steel scattered across a continent struggling to rebuild. The Allied Control Council provided the answer. Between 1946 and 1948, directive after directive declared German armoured vehicles prohibited materials, relics of a militarism that could never be allowed to rise again. The order went out: destroy them. The Ruhr's great steel cities became graveyards of a different kind. In Bochum, Essen, and Magdeburg, long trains arrived carrying hulls that had once terrified whole armies. Workers in heavy gloves moved among them with cutting torches, slicing through armor plate that had been designed to stop artillery shells. Panthers were reduced to pieces, Panzer IVs were broken apart. Stubes became scrap. Germany's post-war housing shortage turned this destruction into reconstruction. The same steel that had once thundered across the Eastern Front was melted down and poured into the girders of bridges, the frames of factories, the walls of apartment blocks where survivors were trying to build ordinary lives again. By the end of 1947, hundreds of vehicles had vanished into furnaces, leaving nothing but restructured metal and fading memories. Not everything was melted. Some tanks were pushed into riverbanks along the Enns in Austria. Their massive hulls used to hold eroding soil in place. Others were bulldozed into quarry fills in Central Europe, slowly disappearing beneath encroaching vegetation until the earth swallowed them whole. Still others became targets on British rangers at Lulworth, American rangers at Grafenwöhr, Soviet rangers whose names were classified, hulks pocked with experimental ammunition, their armor tested to destruction so that the next generation of tanks might be designed to survive it. The myths that would later circulate, whispers of sealed bunkers packed with pristine tigers, warehouses of undamaged panthers waiting in secret darkness, had no basis in reality. The available evidence told a simpler story. Almost all of Germany's wartime armor was gone by 1948, dismantled piece by piece in an act of deliberate erasure. But not quite all. Scattered across the globe, a quiet afterlife had begun for a small fraction of those tanks. Nations rebuilding shattered armies looked at the piles of German armor and saw not relics, but tools. France was among the first to see the opportunity. French forces swept through depots in southwest Germany and brought the best of what they found back into service, folding Panthers into the 503rd Combat Tank Regiment. French crews discovered, as their counterparts in the Wehrmacht had, that the Panther's gun and optics were genuinely magnificent. They also discovered, as those same crews had, that the drivetrain had a talent for self-destruction. By 1951, France retired its Panthers, not in defeat, but in exhaustion. The maintenance costs had become impossible to justify. Czechoslovakia took a different approach. Having spent the war as a manufacturing center for German armor, its factories simply kept building. The Hetzer tank destroyer, a compact lethal machine built on the old Panzer 38 chassis, rolled off Czech assembly lines after 1945 and found eager buyers. Switzerland purchased a fleet of them and kept them operational well into the Cold War, valuing their simple mechanics and manageable size. Bulgaria and Romania absorbed Panzer IVs and Stugs, using them for training and border defense until Soviet-supplied T-34s rendered them obsolete. Spain offered one of the stranger chapters in this story. In 1943, hoping to secure German goodwill, Franco had received 20 Panzer IVs and 10 Stugs. They became the backbone of Spanish armored power, clattering across dusty Iberian training grounds alongside elderly Panzer IIs from an earlier era. As the 1960s arrived and the tanks grew old and spare parts grew scarce, Spain made a decision that would write the final operational chapter of the Panzer IV's story. In 1967, 17 surviving vehicles were sold to Syria. Syria put them to work. Through the late 1960s and into the early 1970s, Panzer IVs, designed in Germany in the 1930s, built for a war that had ended a quarter century earlier, sat in prepared positions along the Golan Heights, their long barrels pointed at the Israeli frontier. They represent one of the last known operational deployments of a German Second World War tank, a strange coda to a story that had begun in the fires of Blitzkrieg. By the mid-1950s, the German tank's moment had passed. The great powers had moved on to new machines, standardized, reliable, mass-produced, and supplied in vast quantities through American and Soviet military aid programs. The handful that survived destruction or foreign service found their way into museums, at Bovington in England, at Saumur in France, at Kubinka outside Moscow, Curators and veterans preserved the remaining examples, a tiger here, a panther there, a solitary Moors that Soviet engineers had reassembled from pieces found at Kummersdorf. These survivors became monuments to a particular kind of engineering genius, brilliant in conception, brutal in execution, and ultimately unsustainable. The German tank had offered the world extraordinary lessons about firepower, optics, and sloped armor, lessons that shaped every tank built in the Cold War decades that followed. But the men who had designed them, built them, and died inside them were gone. The factories that had produced them had been bombed to rubble. The army that had fielded them had ceased to exist. What remained were a few steel ghosts in museum halls and the long shadow they cast over everything that came after.